What's going on, everyone? Thanks for checking out 6 Point Survival. Today I updated my iPhone to iOS 18, and one of the updates is they have topographic maps. If you zoom in enough, I believe it's everywhere in the country, possibly coming to more than that. We're in the US, by the way, through the whole country, possibly coming out for other countries around the world. They're going to have topographic maps. All you got to do is zoom in. We'll go over how to do it on here, but that leads to the problem that a lot of people don't understand how to read contour lines and topographic maps. So that's what we're going to go over today, checking out how to read contour lines. We'll go over what a contour line is, how to read it, make it all make sense, and then you too can do some land nav on your iPhone or whatever map you want to use. Let's check it out. Contour lines. I really like teaching contour lines using a lake or body of water. It seems to make a little bit more sense to people initially when we're trying to define a contour line, and then we'll actually go up and look at some mountains and some hills to start reading those different contours. So first of all, let's define what a contour line is. It is a single level or unchanging elevation. So when you walk a path and the elevation doesn't change at all, you're walking a contour line. On topographic maps, these are marked to help us identify where hills are, where valleys are, peaks, saddles, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to be able to figure out how to identify topographic terrain based on these contour lines. When I was doing some research for this video, I found apparently the longest named thing in America, possibly the world. I don't know. This thing's super long. I'm going to play it real quick because I can't pronounce it. This lake right here is actually, this is the abbreviated name of this lake. I hope you guys can hear this. I'm going to play it. That is the name of the lake that we're going to work with today. That's awesome. Okay, so with a contour line, we can see right here, some of them will have the elevation listed out being a single unchanged elevation. So this right here, if I walk this circle, I'd be walking at 600 feet of elevation. The lake does the same thing, right? A water line, this water line right here is going to be the same unchanging elevation the entire time. So that is essentially a contour line. So we can start to figure out terrain features based on that. Let's do a quick breakdown though of what the contour features are, what the names are that we're going to be looking at. So first you're going to have something like a peak. That's going to be an enclosed contour line. Some people will say an enclosed circle, but obviously this one's very egg-shaped. This one is all kinds of squiggly and random shaped, but it's still enclosed, making that technically a peak, although it's probably more likely a plateau. If we move away from the lake a little bit, we'll see another one there, another one there. So that is just where the elevation stops going up. There's another little one there. So those are your peaks. I don't know of any that are in this area, but you're also going to have bowls or low-lying areas, essentially a dried up lake, and those will often have little tick marks coming to the inside. So those little tick marks are going to indicate a bowl. Normally these fill up with water, but there are certain areas in the world where they don't, and you will have a low-lying depression. Then we have ridge lines. Ridge lines are going to be high areas coming down from a peak. So it's important when we talk about this, when we talk about ridge lines and drainages, that we remember it's all relative to high or low ground. So right here we have a U or a V, and they're pointing away from this peak. This is the high ground. So that's going to be a ridge line. That's going to be a elevated area of terrain. And then right here, not quite as distinct, it's a little more subtle, but we have little U's pointing up towards this peak. That is going to be a drainage or a low area. If we move over here to Sugarloaf Hill, we see this ridge line coming down a little bit more distinctly. So we have our peak right here and then our ridge line coming down. When you get contour lines that are really close, that means you're going to have steeper terrain. So you're going to be going up in elevation a lot faster. When they're a little bit more spread out like they are on this ridge line, that means it's going to be a little bit more shallow sloping terrain. So right here, this is going to be relatively flat terrain compared to, say, this area right here. You also have something called a saddle, which is where one peak will come down and then back up to another peak. If I see any here in a moment, I will point that out. Here you kind of have one. So we have this hill right here. It's going to go down, 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 and then it pops back up just a little bit to get to that peak. So that would be technically a saddle, although it's kind of a weak one because it goes down quite a bit and only pops back up to 850 feet. Those are going to be the big ones that we are going to be looking at. So now let's look at how these actually work and how we can start to determine terrain based on that. So we'll jump up here a little bit and take a look right here. We can kind of see some contour lines. I'll move it. We're going to use the coast of this lake and pretend that this is a contour line. Again, in theory it is. It's just not one that directly shows on the map as a contour line. But this lake is going to be sitting flat, so you're going to have an unchanging amount of elevation. Meaning if you were to walk this lake coast, you're going to stay at the same elevation the whole time. So when we look at somewhere like this, where this little bay comes in right here, if I was going to try and walk from this neighborhood and across to here, it would have to go downhill, which is why this area is filled with water, before it comes back uphill and hits this, meaning this would be a ridge line, and this would be a drainage, a low-lying area. So you have your ridge lines, they're higher, and your drainage is here. Again, if we were to walk a straight line from the edge of this road over to the edge of this ridge line, it's going to go downhill. So you have a large drainage that would show there, and then another ridge line here. Again, when you are looking at hills or at the actual map itself, it's going to be all relative to the higher low ground. If you can't figure that out pretty quickly, the easiest thing that you can do is find a peak or a waterway. Water is never going to flow on a ridge line. It's always going to go downhill into drainages. So that's a quick, easy way to figure out if there is a annual or perennial stream going through there. This stream right here is going through a drainage, and we can see that right there. We have those V's pointing up towards the peak. So that's a low-lying area, and then right here you have the V's or U's pointing away from your peak. That is going to be your ridge line. So let's take a look at what this actually looks like. Okay, so here is one idea that is going to take your two-dimensional contour lines and then put them into a three-dimensional image. So this has most of the terrain features we're going to see other than a low-lying area, but you're going to have two peaks. So right here, and then if we look up here, there's a peak. And then at the top of this larger hill, you have your peak up there. And that is that enclosed contour line. And then as we come down, we can see how the contour lines have been sliced. We'll just say feet. So 40 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet, and 10 feet. And then each of those contour lines are marked. You have your higher areas. So coming off of this closer peak to us, you have kind of a nice gentle sloping, and that's going to spread out those contour lines on our map as we're walking down or up. Opposite of that, right? So we have these U's that are pointing away from the peak that makes our ridge lines. We have our U's pointing uphill, and that's going to make our depressions. So if I wanted to try and walk a straight line through this, I would have to walk downhill and then back uphill to get to here versus walking around at that same elevation. So we have peaks, ridge lines, drainages. This is a good example of a saddle right here. You come off of one peak, you walk downhill, almost always on a ridge line with a saddle, and then back uphill to another peak over here. And as we can see, you're walking through this, you have lots of little drainages here, and then a bunch of big ridge lines. They don't have to be in straight lines, so this ridge line curves as it comes up the side of this hill. The backside of this hill would be really steep with how close these contour lines are together, as is a few places in here, versus out here you have these more subtle increases, which is why we see those contour lines really spread out again. That is the basics for understanding contour lines. Here's another good graph on how to read these. So this is just kind of a matchup option. So you have a small subtle hill that's kind of sloping, gently sloping, that comes up to a little peak right there. and then comes down. So this is a saddle, and then it's going to get real steep. So we see those contour lines get close together up to a peak. This is just a pyramid shape, a little more gentle on the sides with our ridge lines, but then on the sides facing away from us and towards us, you have that steeper elevation. Here's a little bit more appropriate saddle where the peaks are closer to the same height. This fourth one down, you have a nice gentle sloping side, so you got the contour lines pretty far apart right here, and then they're real steep on this left side after the peak that is dropping off steep. This is more of that plateau I mentioned a minute ago where you have that kind of long oval peak shaped, and then this is just another example of a saddle. Look at what this looks like real world as you'd be viewing a map versus what you might be seeing out in front of you. This photo right here, courtesy of the National Park Service, is taken from Black Mountain's overlook right on the bend of the Blue Ridge Parkway here. You can actually kind of see it right there. So it's a little more zoomed in than you might see in real life, but that is the same two peaks that we see in the foreground right there. And then behind that, you can see the entire mountain ridge line here. But for learning purposes, this photo is going to be a little bit easier. As we look out at this photo, these contour interval, by the way, I didn't talk about that earlier. Contour interval is just the vertical elevation between two contour lines. So these are 80 foot, I believe. This is in feet, contour elevation. So each one of these, as you hit each one, you would be going vertically 80 feet. There's obviously some variance there if you're walking in an area like this one, and this one right here. That's a really long distance. You're probably not going to be walking on flat terrain right there. It's probably going up, 50, 60, 70 feet, and then back down, and then back up, and then back down, and then you hit that next 80-foot level. So for this one, what we're looking at right here, this one is looking out to the west, the image that you're seeing right here. So it goes all downhill, and then it comes back uphill. We see there's a nice ridge line right there. We can see a couple of drainages going right there, and then we have kind of a elongated peak right there, and then you have an actual more defined peak right there. So what we see in our image here on the right is a more defined, slightly higher peak, a lower one, so that kind of gives you that image of a saddle, and then it drops downhill. This would be going north because, again, we're looking west, and then it also drops downhill going to the south. So as I'm looking at this, I have a drop off, comes back up. I have a long ridge line coming off the front. If I look at this peak right here on the right, coming off the front, I can kind of see this ridge line coming down and curving slightly south. And I see the same thing right here. I also have this nice big drainage that actually leads down, looks like into some type of creek or river. And I see that right here. In between the saddle here, we have this other smaller drainage, and I see that running through right there. You can see it's a little bit depressed, and then we have a couple other small ridgelines and drainages coming off of this one, but the big one is coming off to the south, and we notice this actually gets a little further from us, and then we have this nice long stretching ridge line coming off of that, which I'm guessing is going to be that right there. As we look at the next mountain range, obviously further behind it, we're going to move back a little bit on the map. So we had our two center peaks right here. We have a whole highway, waterway system. Now there's another little ridge line and mountain range right here. But we notice these peaks are almost at 4,000 feet. These ones aren't even to 3,600. So we're not going to see this stuff. This stuff's all going to be hidden behind this closer mountain range. So we need to go a little further till we start to get to some mountains that are higher elevation than that. And then we start to get into these high peaks over here. I'm going to back up just a little bit. So we have our viewing point. We have our two peaks right there. And then again, looking further to the west, we have this really nice, defined, long, stretching mountain range right here. So off of this is going to be a series of different peaks. If we zoom in, lost it. If we zoom in, we can see a bunch of different peaks. There's a couple right there. And then these really nice defined drainages. The Google Maps, good job on your contouring and your design for this. This looks really good. You can really tell this is a drainage, right? Those low-lying areas. And then they really did a good job of highlighting, making this look like it's elevated, which it would be. So if I wanted to walk from, say, the tip of this ridge line over to the tip of this ridge line, if I was going to do a navigational leg doing that, I'm going to drop off of this pretty steep. It's going to be going downhill, downhill, but it's also going to be pulling through these little drainages. If I was walking straight up here, as we get down around here, we're actually going to start going uphill. We see that ridge line right there, so we got a little uphill, and then it's going to go back downhill through this creek, and then you pretty much have all uphill. There's a little ridge line right there you might be able to walk on. Walking on ridge lines is going to be a lot easier than drainages, so honestly, if I was going to do this, that's a lot of elevation change. I would strongly consider walking around on this and then coming down this ridge line. Depends why I was traveling, you know, what my goals were and stuff, but that's going to be a much easier walk than going down through this drainage. My guess is that's going to be pretty miserable. But let's see if we can find these guys on the map. All right, there's our overlook point. There's our first two peaks that are in the foreground. And then we go further back. If we're kind of lining this up here, we have these right here. I'm noticing that these peaks are almost all equal elevation, but then we have a real big drop right there. So that should be pretty noticeable on our contour lines. And then we also have a pretty big drop off right here. So I'm looking at a really flat, elongated peak there, but that's 1. That's probably going to show up as 2. So 2, 3. A steeper saddle, 4. A shallow saddle, 5, 6. And then a big drop off. So we have a big drop off, 6 peaks that are going to be similar height, and then another big drop off. We notice this one's a little bit more shallow. Keep in mind, these could be coming towards us or going away from us. It's going to be more up to the map, but don't necessarily try and assume that this is going to be going straight one direction. These can be curved, just like we saw with this closer one. As we're looking at this, like I said, we're going to look for those kind of 6 peak series, and then figure out where those bigger drop-offs are. So I'm seeing a pretty big drop-off right here in elevation. This is going to go from, that's 6,200. That's going to be 6,400. So that's 6,400 right there. And then look at that deep gap. That's going to be what we're seeing right there. Right, because now this is coming down below. If we have our index line, that's the one that tells us the elevation. It's going to go below 5,800, flirting with 5,600 on that one right there. So you have a 1,000-foot elevation change going through that. Like I said, my guess is that's going to be the deep gap. And then we have a peak there. We have another peak that may be showing up as 2 in there. We have this steep drop off, that saddle right there. Let's see if we can find that one. I don't want to get too close or else we're going to lose our contour lines. But I see an index line for 6,400. Yeah, we got 200-foot intervals. So 6,200 drops off and comes back up. And then we have a nice long stretching ridge line. That one's going to be coming towards us, going mostly east, which we may be seeing here, or that could be the end of this right here. We have another high one here. This one's going to be 6,600 on the summit. So that's likely going to be somewhere up here. All right, so what I'm looking at, I am checking this contour line right here. This campground is going to be below this ridge line, right? Again, we have those V's pointing away from our peaks. That's going to be a ridge line coming down. This is all behind this ridge line, so we're not going to see any of this back here. So we're seeing that that ridge line kind of come towards us, and that's looking like what that is right there, as this peak is likely going to be Mount Mitchell right there, and then we have a kind of long, shallow drop off, comes back up. We got a couple small peaks right here. We have our summit point, so we got two separate ones right there, and I'm seeing those in the mountain. And then we have a steep drop off and back up, and that one's a little bit quicker than this between these two, which I see a steep drop off and back up right here. This is likely going to be a little more shallow and then really long. So we have a little more shallow, extends out. Got a couple more peaks up here. And then we get to this deep gap section, which we have that deep gap right there, or that nice good looking saddle. So if we look off the front of this and we're trying to determine, are these the peaks we're actually looking at, we can start to use these ridge lines, assuming this drainage right here is the deep gap. That's going to come right there. Off of that, we have a ridge line coming down there, and then a much more defined ridge line coming down off of these, we'll call them twin peaks right here, and that's what I'm seeing coming down from that. As we continue to move, we have a really big drainage, or a bowl almost, in front of this whole section right there. Get to our summit point right here, and then we have that nice long ridge line coming down. And again, I see that nice long ridge line right there. And finally, we are at Mount Mitchell, and that looks like it comes down. Could also bend down right there. It's kind of hard to tell because that photo ends, but then we have this good drainage, and you can see all these little mini drainages and ridge lines running through these as well. But we have our nice main drainage running down here, and I see that off of this, right? And then again, we have a lot of these mini drainages and ridge lines that are kind of through there. But that is what you're going to be looking at as you're looking at a map, right? So when we're looking at these contour lines and trying to determine, well, where am I going to go, or what am I actually looking at when I'm looking out at nature, that's how these are going to match up. If you guys have any questions on contour lines or how they work or reading them, feel free to reach out, give me a shout. I would love to help out. Talk soon. See ya. Test on the microphone volume. You need to listen to the sound of this lake, though. Are you ready? It's the longest name of anything in the United States, and it's a lake in Massachusetts. Slow down. In other news, I recently got a 3D printer and printed out these cool little 3D models of how to read contour lines. So this is a 3D model, and then there's the contour lines for that model. It's pretty neat.